There's many scenes in the film where we actually blended the human voice with coyotes wailing, because that makes you think, what am I hearing? Hi, I'm Johnnie Burn, sound designer of 28 Years Later, and we are going behind the scenes with Collider. You go in a studio afterwards and you change things for the nuance and the balance. And with this, Danny was actually really keen on bearing in mind, the legacy of the original 28 Days film and how important the sounds were and how guttural and real and visceral everything felt. So it was about understanding the emotion of a scene and whether or not we were kind of scaring people. For a lot of it, you're actually trying to create a soundscape where you're immersing people in a credible world that is kind of new to them, that has nuances of subtlety that you have to kind of work out. So in some cases, it's like, make a scary guttural sound, but don't be too human, make it a little bit animal. And there's many scenes in the film where we actually blended the human voice with coyotes wailing. Because that makes you think, what am I hearing? And because we're in 28 years later and these infected people have become now part of the kind of wild soundscape of Britain. A lot of it was be animalistic with it and be guttural and visceral, and whatever you do, don't hold back. Because, you can really tell when someone's sort of actually kind of faking it to some degree, and it's really important to kind of put your heart into a scary sound or it doesn't work. Sound goes straight in the brainstem, and so if the sound is literally, you don't have to think about it, it's just inherently scary, then that's going to make the hairs tingle. These people are very talented actors, and they understand that if you stand there static and make a sound, it's not going to sound the same as it does if your diaphragm is moving. I worked on the Zone of Interest, and there's a scene where we hear Rudolf Hoss outside the window and he's on a horse, and we never actually see it, but we recorded it with him on the horse because we knew that his body movement and everything would have to sound correct. So shaping your body and the body language of how that feeds into your performance is important. And I think if you just stood there statically and did it, it would be half of the puzzle. As humans, sound is the way we communicate, and you can tell when it's fake. If you went into sound post-production, you probably wouldn't understand what it is you didn't like about it, but you know that you were not believing the film, the scene, or whatever you were being told at that time. That would be the net result. It's, workshopping. There's a lot of, how about this? And one of the main sounds is an infected on top of the hill, and he lets out this huge guttural roar. And for about 3 months of the whole period, whilst we were making it, that was me for a while, and then one of my assistants and my daughter at one point, and just trying different ways. And it turned out that in the final mix, the sound that we have on that is a guy called Mark Knight, who was the mix stage engineer who helped set up and everything. And we were discussing with Danny how this sound wasn't just perfect yet, and he let slip that he was a death metal vocalist. And we were like, wait, he's like, oh yeah, that kind of stuff, I ate it up for breakfast. And Danny was like, well, go on there. And he did, and that's what went in the film. It's about workshopping and experimenting with things to picture and seeing if you believe it, basically. And there's a lot of places in the film where we took the sounds and the recordings that we have and then blended them with, like I say, coyotes or pigs or lion roars and all sorts. And there's very clever software that can do that. It's about sort of working with what you know is going to work with what you've already got and pieces of a jigsaw puzzle. It's very complicated. In this film, there's no electricity and there's no tech because, England has gone to ruin. And there are stock sound effects that you can get, but they never quite encapsulate what you're looking for. So the hardest thing was actually to go out and record all sounds of nature around England, but without the hum of traffic that constantly exists in most places. A couple of guys from my team, Max and Brennan, spent a week in deepest Wales woods with rucksacks and camping and getting as far away from traffic as they could to find the stillness and the bird song and enough complexity that we could layer it up to say that England doesn't have cars, but it still sounds thick and detailed because nature has overgrown. I love the idea that if birds don't bother singing near a motorway because they know that they can't be heard, right? But if the whole world is really quiet, then all the animals pipe up and they can communicate across vast distances. And that's what we played with here, was layering up many, many different sounds of nature to create a kind of a thick canopy of what Britain would sound like if it had gone that way.
I really like it.
One of the most powerful tools we've got as film sound designers is silence. And that's as universal now as it was 30 years ago. Once you step into the area of taking all the sound away, the viewer's imagination starts to put their own things in there, and that is scarier than anything I could potentially give you, so because it's your own fears and stuff. So there was a lot of that, but 28 days later, it was the seminal zombie movie. There was real credibility to how these infected humans were sounding, and they were very raw and guttural and not hammy, for want of a better word. The basic principles of making sure things sounded credible and not overdoing it were, still very much apply. And yeah, I suppose the thing we had to be careful of is, it's much easier these days to make a Dolby Atmos full, thick soundscape and potentially overdo it, but I don't think we did that. There's a bit where we see the man hanging upside down, like 20 minutes into the film, the hanging man. And he's an infected who's been captured, strung up by his feet. He has a plastic bag over his head. Yeah, it's just awful because, it's the kind of thing they say, don't try this at home. But we did have one of the guys in my sound team, and we had him in a voice booth, and we stuck a plastic bag over his head and, taped it up, and were ready there with a pair of scissors to puncture it. But getting things to sound right was probably the biggest challenge. So an unexpected source was the risk of suffocation, I suppose. I mean, the whole film had a need to create sounds that were unique, and even the bone temple stuff later on in the film. What we wanted to feel was that once you get across the river and you get onto this island and this doctor has made this enormous temple out of human bones, that you could kind of feel the ambience blowing through it and the winds and the atmosphere. And fortunately, with my zero musical skills of playing an instrument, I could take lots of different wind instruments, flutes, and even scaffolding poles and all sorts, and play them badly. And that's the soundscape you hear in that. It's lots of out of tune instruments. The scene on the Causeway, the whole scene when Spike and Jamie run back to the island at night under that incredible, beautifully starlit sky, is actually incredibly complicated. The timing of how it works and the jeopardy of the alpha that chases them, and the need to hear their footsteps pounding, and yet having close enough that he's a real threat, but not close enough that you don't believe that he could have got them. The trajectory of the narrative, combined with the need to have very threatening, dangerous sound design overlaid on top of Wagner's Ring Cycle, the Valkyries, which is essentially a beautiful piece of music, but you're sort of layering threat on top of that. So I think that was the thing that we went over and over, trying to make that work. Because the sound design in the film is sort of like the subconscious of the film, it's the latent threat going on the whole time, along with the score.
Johnny, thank you so much for your time. This has been amazing.
So lovely to talk to you, Michael. Thank you so much for your interest.